Welcome to the Talent Development Hot Seat, a show where I interview business executives, talent development professionals, and thought leaders to find out what has been successful and challenging in the world of talent development. My objective is to share ideas, valuable lessons, tools, advice, and trends. My hope is that all of this will ultimately help you, the listener, expand your knowledge, grow your career, and accelerate your success as a talent development professional. Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I am your host, Andy Storch, and I am so grateful that you are joining me today for an interview with Jim Selman. And Jim has been a leading thinker and practitioner in business transformation since 1977. He has authored several books and articles, including Leadership, and his newest book is called Living in a Real-Time World, 6 Capabilities to Prepare Us for an Unimaginable Future. And this book explores 6, as I mentioned, conversational capabilities that we can cultivate to navigate uncertainty and learn what we need to know when we need to know it. More of an art than a science, these innate capabilities tune the way we experience our circumstances, our relationships, our past, our present, and our future. And these are things that I always love talking about, especially as we explore the future of work and where organizations are going. So I'm really interested in talking with you today. So welcome to the podcast, Jim.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, really great to have you on. I know you've been doing a lot of interesting work over the years and the decades, and I always think it's interesting to ask someone to compress that down into a few moments. But maybe you could share a little bit of background of how you got to where you are today.
Well, Andy, I started in the mid-'70s doing a lot of large-scale systems change kind of work, primarily in the public sector for a company that's now called Deloitte Touche. And I became somewhat fascinated with the question of why it's so difficult to implement anything at scale. And as a consequence of that, I took my consulting business and practice and sort of moved it into the world of people, and at that time the idea of organizational culture didn't exist. So I was one of the first people to conceive of culture as a phenomenon and begin to think of ways to change culture and create culture. And then that's gradually grown to the point that I was perhaps one of the first people to introduce the concept of coaching as an alternative paradigm for work and for management. And from there, I've been doing a lot of pretty innovative, interesting kinds of organizational, transformational projects and working with corporate leaders in terms of how they're dealing with the future and how they're dealing with many of the challenges that exist in business today.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you mentioned really this idea of culture and how that defines organizations. And I feel like it's a hot topic these days. I mean, how far back does that go? And was that something that people were really talking about, in the 80s or the 90s, or do you think it's something that's more popular as a conversation today?
No, I think it was a big conversation in the 80s and 90s. I think in the 70s it didn't exist. I think culture was strictly ballet and opera in those days. But the question really was, there's something going on that's making it difficult to change. So, for example, during the re-engineering era, in the billions and billions of dollars that were spent to try to re-engineer organizations, most of them reportedly have failed or fallen short. And the consequence of that is because of people and culture, according to the Wall Street Journal. And the question is, what's going on? And so it's led me to a different approach to understanding people and who we are as human beings, and understanding culture having more to do with our conversations than anything tangible. One of the big problems we have is we tend to objectify people, call them human resources, and we objectify culture as if it's the same as a table or a chair. And when you objectify something, you actually make it more difficult to deal with it, because now your interpretation of it is going to be argumentative and definitional, but not really give you much power to change the phenomenon or to impact what it is you're talking about.
So how do we, as you mentioned that the problem is we objectify people and we objectify culture. We just talk about it like it's a thing that can so easily be changed. How do we change that mindset? How do companies shift so that they're not making that mistake?
Well, first of all, I don't think you change the mindset. I think you create a new one. So in my case, I've been working a lot with a man named Dr. Fernando Flores over the years, who's in my view, a seminal thinker in terms of being able to appreciate that language is really the medium in which we deal with reality, and that if we really want to change something, we need to be able to observe what we're talking about. So I can observe conversation. I can't observe values, for example. So I can talk about values all day long, but it doesn't help me change what I'm talking about. But if I look at values as something that gets expressed in conversations, then I can begin to say, well, if I want to change the value set or change my values, it's going to show up and occur by changing my conversation.
I like what you said there. You can't observe values, but you can observe how they're being lived, right? I mean, you can observe conversations, you can observe people's actions. Are they acting with integrity? Are they focusing on profit or the customers or whatever the important values might be? You see it in their actions.
Well, yes, you can infer that, but you can't observe it directly. And in a real-time world, in a stable world that doesn't change very often, you can build models and you can build interpretations. You can discover recipes through trial and error, and then you apply those recipes, and you'll more or less get a predictable result.
And I can observe that you have a dog there somewhere in your house as we record this.
Okay. But the point is that excuse me just a minute. Yeah. Okay, sorry, my apology. The point is, in a stable world, you can develop patterns and behaviors and recipes and apply them. In a world that's changing faster than we can even comprehend, that idea of looking for recipes is ineffective. So you have to shift from more of a knowledge-based approach to living to much more of a generative and creative approach, what I call navigating. When you don't have maps of where you're going, then you need to invent the maps as you go. And that's a very different paradigm and a very different mindset for any leader today in an organization, because so much of our planning and our thinking about the future is grounded in the past. It's all more or less predictive as an extension and taking trends and so forth and projecting them into the future. It's not that they're wrong. It's just that increasingly we're discovering that the world doesn't turn out the way we would like to imagine it will be.
Right. But isn't history a pretty good predictor of the past? I mean, isn't it important that we study history to see how things have unfolded to inform us and to, help inform our predictions or our decisions for the future?
Well, that's the tricky part, and that's really what the common sense that I'm challenging in this book. Because I'm really saying, from a common sense point of view, what you said is of course true.
Yeah.
However, in a rapidly changing world, common sense isn't common anymore. It doesn't work. Or if you rely on it to make your decisions and invest your resources, you're taking increasing risk, because we have more than ample evidence from disruptors in business to new technologies and so forth that reality doesn't care what we think, and that we're really dealing with something that's unprecedented. And that's really the question, is if you accept that that change is not only faster, it's accelerating.
Yeah, I heard a saying recently that the rate of change is faster than it has ever been before, and yet it is slower today than it will ever be in the future. So the rate of change just keeps getting faster. Things are changing all the time. And what you're saying is that we obviously can't do things the way we've done in the past. We have to change. We can't just rely on knowledge and history. we have to be able to take, I think, more of an iterative approach is what you said, to be willing to try different things and pivot faster to be successful?
Well, I mean, all of that's true. I mean, the model or the metaphor I'm using is Star Trek Enterprise. And if you really buy into the idea that we're going where no one's gone before, and if you accept that premise, then we have to acknowledge that we're inventing the future. We're not going into a future that's there waiting for us. So if you go back to your original point about prediction, those past-based predictions imply that the future is a certain way if we can only predict it correctly. Another both philosophical and practical way of thinking is that there is no future there waiting for us to arrive. It's going to be whatever our actions produce. So just as our current reality has been produced by our historical and past actions, our future is also going to be a function of our actions.
Right.
The question is, what's organizing our actions? If your actions are based on your predictions, you're going to get variations of what you predict, or not. And what I'm suggesting is that leadership and organizations need to give up their attachment to the way it was or their imagining how it might be, and start really getting clear, what are we committed to produce? Let the commitment drive our actions rather than our predictions determine our commitments.
Yeah.
If reality is determined, if your view of reality determines what you commit to, by definition, you're going to get a bit more of the same. If you're in a real-time world, making decisions that way is almost certainly a formula for failure and being left behind.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about, I like what you said about how we sometimes think we're entering this future that's already there, but we're defining the future based on the decisions we make, right? The actions we take. And it reminds me of something I've thought about many times, which is that we always fret over these really big decisions, and then they almost always turn out right? It's almost like in many situations in our life, we couldn't make the wrong decision because things will work out. You make a decision and then you live with that decision and you move on. Now, it may not have been the best choice sometimes. We have to pivot and we go back and change. But what you're saying is that, companies need to define their future. They can't rely on what's been done in the past and what the history tells them. Can you give an example of where a company has made a mistake with this? I mean, obviously, I think of classic examples like Kodak completely ignoring, the movement into digital, even though they had the technology. But what else, is there an example to kind of bring this to life?
Well, there are lots of them. And in fact, I read a list someplace of it was showing conversations that have no possibility, like the head of the patent office saying pretty much everything's been invented that can be invented, or common conventional wisdom, things like we can never run a 4-minute mile, or we've got the Kodak and the Polaroid and the corporate examples, digital computer, completely missed they thought the future was small computers. IBM almost went out of business by building their corporate commitments based on their historical successes, and that by investing more in what we think made us successful has worked more or less in a stable, slow changing reality. That's nothing illegitimate about that. It's only dangerous and difficult when suddenly the rate of change happens. When that happens, if you make your decisions based on what made you successful in the past, your likelihood of failure or something bad happening is pretty high.
Yeah, it's interesting how things have changed, and we always think that we are at this point where how could we possibly invent anything new, right? We have all these crazy bells and whistles technology, and yet we're always inventing new things. So tell me a little bit more about this book that you have now, Living in a Real-Time World. And, you and I were talking right before we started recording about the problem with people always trying to predict. People always want to predict the future, even though nobody really knows what's going to happen. I think people are a little bit obsessed with making those predictions, right? If you ever turn on cable news, which I don't watch at all, but I feel like it's full of talking heads making predictions about the future, even though they have no accountability to
Well,
whether that prediction comes true or not.
yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, if you think about it, a prediction is just an assessment. It's a judgment. Okay, how well grounded that judgment is, or how thoughtful it is, it's still a judgment. And linguistically speaking, and practically speaking, one of the big ahas in the work I've been doing is showing people that judgments and assessments can never be true. They are always relative to an observer, and they're not facts. They're conclusions. They're assumptions. They're built on some a narrative or some structure of thinking that has you see it that way. So there's nothing wrong with them, but they're not true or false. The problem is when we start to believe that our assessments about the future are the truth. Okay, and then we start living and acting consistent with what we think. Now, if you looked at missed opportunities, whether it was the railroads missing the airline industry or various kinds of myopia, it's just part of the human nature is that you kind of see what you see and you do what you do based on how you view your world. The problem is if the world is changing faster, then you have to figure out a different way of viewing it. Now, again, if you stop trying to control the future and you start creating the future, then it's a pretty easy move. The problem is if you try to control something that you don't control. So I tell people frequently, and it's very much at the center of this book, is that we don't really have much, if any, control. But we always have a choice in how we relate to the world. We always have a choice in how we relate to what's happening. And that's what's emerging in this real-time world, I think, is what you might call a relational view of reality.
Yeah.
Where if you want to change something, change your relationship to it. So if you're frustrated, change your relationship to frustration rather than change what you think is frustrating you. Would be another.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, you see people all the time that are complaining about changes that are happening in their organization or with technology or things that are happening to them instead of embracing that and saying, okay, this is an opportunity for me. How can I take advantage of this? And that can be true for companies or for individuals. But I want to shift and talk about it from an organizational standpoint. I know you can't make a prediction, but where is work going? What is happening to jobs? How should people that are involved in talent development be thinking about this?
Well, let me finish the other question just slightly and then and then address what you just asked, because my view is that the world is filled with models and suggestions and people telling people what they need to change. I'm saying if we're going to deal with a real-time world, we have to see that all of the capabilities we need to deal with it are already within us. That we don't have to, everybody has an ability to read, whether you're literate or not. So what I'm suggesting in this book is that we all have the fundamental capabilities that we need to succeed and prosper in a real-time world. They're already within us. They're already available. Our ability to learn, our ability to relate, our ability to listen. Those are already innate capabilities. The question is now, can we exercise and cultivate those capabilities to deal with this unprecedented reality? Now, if I try to look at the future of work from my point of view, the first thing I'll always say, or the future of anything, by the way, I'd say I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows. And I think that the compare our prediction game is pretty much a waste of time. I think we need to ground our assessments about the future, but just get that it doesn't give us any more certainty than if we didn't. Now, if we're looking for certainty, we have a problem. If we're looking for clarity, we have what we need to begin to navigate effectively in this real-time world. Now, personally, I typically will take the more dramatic expectations and predictions as an assumption, but not as something that I think is necessarily true. In fact, not true. So, for example, I buy into the idea that work is dramatically undergoing change in the sense that the concept of a job is disappearing. Our relationship to employers is disappearing. our closely held common sense, like business produces jobs, is false. I think that political narrative is a con. Trying to convince people that if we do good things for business, we'll have more work and more jobs. I think it's an absolutely shameful con, because if you look at it, business has consistently been getting rid of jobs at an increasing rate. So whether it's call centers or kiosks in the airport or robots, the nature of work itself is changing. Now, what I'm proposing is that in a real-time world, one of the capabilities you need to be able to develop is the ability to make an offer. So stop asking me, what do I need? And start telling me, what do you got? Show me something that I don't already know, and I might need to hire you to work with me. So we're all becoming what you might call solopreneurs, individual entrepreneurs who are navigating in the world. Now, the millennials, I think, are sort of onto this with the gig economy idea and things of that sort. But at the end of the day, how you make a livelihood is going to be a function of what you have to offer and what you're committed to producing. And if what you're committed to producing is needed and wanted, you'll do fine. If you're waiting for the world to somehow make an offer to you, that's not going to work. Now, the practical example of this that I'm fond of talking about is in the area of recruiting. It's one of the most wasteful activities in business. Okay, it's a game that everybody knows is a game and they don't particularly like, where if as an applicant you show me your best side and I'm trying to make judgments if you fit a predefined job I've established, particularly in a corporation. So I'm judging you to see if I think you'll fit this job profile. And then we have what you might call a game of show and tell. So I'll judge you and you show me and we'll go back and forth. And at the end of the day, we'll either hire you or we won't. If I don't hire you, you're usually disappointed. And if I do hire you, there's usually a fairly long learning curve. And if you're not very effective in making those initial decisions, it's a highly expensive activity because you're going to be with me for some period of time before we realize we made a mistake. And then you go your separate ways. So it's a dance between the employer and the applicant that's not very effective. Now, an alternative, which I'm suggesting, is what I call a dialogic interview, where rather than trying to see if you fit the right slot, we have a dialogue in which I tell you what I'm trying to do in my world, and then you and I have a dialogue to see what you have to offer. In the course of that dialogue, you're creating the job. You're not seeing if you fit the criteria. And as a consequence, in that, it's either patently obvious that you're the right guy and you've already created your job and you hit the job with less learning curve, and it's now your commitment that's driving the future, rather than you trying to see, how you fit into my world. And as a consequence, you begin to build much more partnership, co-creativity, collaboration, and generative action in the organization. A practical example of this, a CEO I was working with liked this idea. He was interviewing a fellow that for a senior executive job, who everybody else thought was terrific and had given the thumbs up to. In 10 minutes, it became obviously that it was a mistake from both points of view, just by saying to the fellow, this is what I want, and not what do I think you should do. And in that dialogue space or dialogue context, they parted amicably. It was obviously a mistake on both parts. And once the other people in the organization had seen what had happened, they agreed. They just didn't see it because they were so busy trying to judge and evaluate this fellow's resume and this fellow's past experience to see if he would fit this historically defined past-based set of criteria. So anyway, that's just a practical example of the kind of changes in organization that are probable in this real-time world that we're living in. Another area is that if you can't trust your predictions, what do you do about your budgeting and your planning systems? Because they're all based on predictions and trend and extending trends. Again, I'm saying that at the end of the day, we need to be clear what's the future we're committed to produce, not what is the future we think will happen.
Right. What are we committing to? We don't know what's going to happen in the future, but what are we committing to? Now, I see what you're saying about getting into this, the gig economy or solopreneur economy, where people are able to go sort of pitch their services and say, hey, see what you're doing over here. This is the value I think I might bring. And the company says, great, we'd love to have you on board. But the companies still have to find each other. And I also understand what you're saying about, I've heard the best entrepreneurs or leaders will go out and find great talent and then find something for them to do rather than just filling certain roles. But when you're in a big company, I can hear people pushing back and saying, look, we're in a big company. We have roles that we need to fill. We have jobs that need to be done. We're starting this new project and we need a developer or we need a project manager. How do we go about filling that if you're telling me don't fill roles based on, past definitions and to really just find great people and then see what they can do?
Well, obviously, I think it takes a little time to change the mindset of the executives and the human resource recruiting systems and logic. But if you're looking to fill a role called project manager, I would say start by saying, what do you want the project manager to create or produce, not what you want the project manager to do. So if I say I want the project manager to produce a low-cost new product in half the time, okay, then now let's start having a dialogue with the applicants, even in the current system, to say, here's what we're trying to do is produce a new product in half the time. What do you got to say about that? And begin to shift it to a dialogue, to a conversation about this man's or woman's commitment and how they approach creating that kind of a future. The other thing that's pretty clear to me, Andy, in the world of knowledge is changing in this real-time world, or our relationship to knowledge. Because in the past, we think that you have to know something before you can do something. In a real-time world, you may not know how to do it. You may not have ever done it before. So I'm promoting the idea that there's a distinction called existential confidence that I talk about in the book. Existential confidence is the kind of confidence you have when you're taking on something you've never done before, where you don't have any kind of experience. And maybe nobody's ever done it before. And yet you have the confidence that you'll be able to deal with and take care of whatever needs to be taken care of down the road, even if you can't imagine it or predict it or see what it involves. And that's distinct from ordinary confidence, which is where you've done it before, you know how to do it, and you're now going to do it. You're fairly confident that you can win because you've got a lot of experience and evidence to back you up. But in the real-time world, that we need to have a lot more existential confidence if we're going to be able to authentically and collaboratively co-create this future that we're living into.
Yeah, and I can see that being true because the world's knowledge is so readily available now. We don't necessarily, in the past, you would definitely hire people for their knowledge. Now I would hire people more for their capabilities or, the potential you see in them and let them go on and learn the thing that they need to learn. I've heard plenty of great stories from people who took on a stretch role in an organization and volunteered for something they had no idea how to do, but they knew they could go learn it. And then, put in a lot of long nights of, taking an online course, reading books, whatever it is, going to classes, learning from other people. And then next thing you know, they're the expert in the organization because they took the time to go learn it. And they had the gumption or whatever the word might be to go and take that initiative and learn it. And I can see us moving more in that direction. And so along those lines, when you think about hiring or developing people, if you're thinking about, where do I choose to invest in developing people, you're probably looking more at what, people talk about high potential in organizations, right? Developing our hypos, our high potential employees or managers, whatever it is. You're looking more at what are their capabilities, what is their potential, rather than what knowledge do they have now that we want to promote.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I would say, if I were, and I do say to my clients, look, you want to hire people based on their commitments, and stop the belief that the company's job is to develop them. If they're committed, they will develop and they'll grow and they'll expand like any of us would do in that situation. But the idea that you are an object that I'm going to develop, and that we're going to start with some set of criteria that you're going to fill. Again, all of those are sort of common sense ideas if the world isn't changing. But when the world is changing rapidly, those same ideas will keep you stuck in a very counterproductive and dysfunctional way of relating to the future. The hard thing is really to let go and accept the idea that reality is what it is. And our job isn't to try to figure it out. Our job is to work with whatever's going on, and create the future. I sometimes say, mountain climbers are not overcoming obstacles to get to the top. They're working with those obstacles. They're using those obstacles to accomplish the mission or the goal. And they're not fighting reality. So many corporate people have this view that the job of management is to control people and to control the world and make things happen. And I suggest that you're going to get more of what you resist, and that it's going to be deadly if you're living that inside that belief in a real-time world, because you're going to become a spectator, and you're going to be sitting there watching television and watching the news and reading books and having conversations about the future, rather than having conversations to produce the future.
Yeah.
How many times have you been in a meeting talking about productivity that didn't produce anything?
Right. Okay, so a lot of big companies out there are making transformations, right? A cultural transformation, digital transformation, strategic transformation. A lot of companies realize we need to change, we need to shift. We can't do things the same as we have done before. How do they adapt to this and prepare themselves for the future of work, no matter what?
Well, first thing is the word transformation, like the word coaching in a lot of our lexicon, has now become vogue. So everything now is a transformation. But in fact, I think there's a big distinction between change, even big change, and transformation. That to me, transformation is a much more fundamental and sustainable shift in how you relate to something, not the way you do something. So you can become a lot more, develop significant changes and even important changes without necessarily transforming anything. Nonetheless, I would really say to any company that you've got to look at two different realities. You've got to look at the reality you predict. Let's call that the predictable future. And then you've got to look at the reality, let's call it the possible future. The possible future is not anywhere close to the same as the predictable future. And I've got lots of examples where a company is, predictably would have been lucky to get 2% growth, get 40% growth in less than a year by changing how they relate to the questions, how they relate to the circumstances, how they relate to each other in the organization. And what they do is they shift to much more of a kind of entrepreneurial mood, the way many startups are, rather than keep grinding and turning the crank on their larger corporate systems and practices. But the idea is, if you're going to live in a real-time world, you better be living into the possible future, not the predictable future.
Got it. So obviously we need to make decisions and we need to make commitments. And a lot of those are based on our predictions, where we think things will go. But what you're suggesting is take a step back and realize there's a difference between the possible future, which is the future that you've identified as to be the most likely, or where you'd like things to go, and also realize that there is a possible future and there are other outcomes that could happen. So we need to prepare for all of those different outcomes so we're not taken off guard.
Yes, and the possible future is not just a bigger prediction. The possible future is an invention. It's a creation.
Hmm.
It's an IC or why not or what if, and then develop the new habit of being able to say what are we committed to make happen, and then plan how to do it, rather than letting our planners and our planning mindset determine what we commit to. If you let the predictable future determine the boundaries inside of which you make commitments and allocate resources, you're always going to be living into that predictable future.
Hmm.
You know, it's the old George Bernard Shaw quote about reasonable people adapt themselves to the circumstances. Unreasonable people adapt the circumstances to themselves. In a real-time world, you better be in the latter camp,
Hmm.
living to make the circumstances fit your commitments, rather than trying to let your view of the circumstances determine what you commit to.
It's fascinating. All right, so we'll kind of wrap this up here, but for someone listening who may be involved in defining how to develop the people in an organization, developing people, whether it's managers or helping people upskill for new roles, get them prepared for how their job may be changing, knowing that we can't predict what those jobs will look like. Jobs 5-10 years from now will be completely different from today. What's one more piece of advice do you give to them to think about these things and help prepare their organization for the future?
Well, I think, again, I don't think I have an easy formula or anything, but I do notice that in many organizations, there's still a kind of paternalistic relationship between senior management and the rest of the organization, as if the people at the top are supposed to know and the people at the bottom need to buy in and go along with whatever the plans and the thinking is. So the first thing I would do is say, let's begin to acknowledge and shift that we start relating to people like they're a whole lot bigger and they know a lot more than perhaps we've given them credit for in the past. I sometimes say that we talk about our employees like they're children that we wish would grow up, rather than talk to them as adults who sometimes behave like children, and start interacting with them as responsible, committed, capable people, and not try to play amateur psychologist and try to figure out what's going on inside their heads. I think if we begin to commit to commitment, commit to creating a culture of commitment, and begin to relating to each other responsibly in that way, then one is that there's very little room to hide. People have to be responsible for their commitments, and they either keep their promises or they don't. And you stop perpetuating this culture of explanation and excuses, which effectively keeps people buried in an historical narrative about the way things are, justified based on their history. And you start getting people to be much more real time in terms of what are we committed to, what's happening, what's missing, are we succeeding, are we not? And basically it has people begin to talk straight and kill a lot of this sort of background noise that undermines and defeats and slows us down at best and stops us at worst, and keeps giving us this sort of self-fulfilling future that at the end of the day is very dangerous and very unproductive. So I would say recognize that people are authentic if you have an authentic conversation with them, and quit trying to figure it out and start having explicit conversations about the things that matter, and then begin trusting each other to coordinate and work together to produce the futures that we want. And if trust is missing, have a conversation about that and produce it, or part ways, because you can't tolerate lack of trust in a real-time world. It's unacceptable. It's a deadly, undermining, self-destructive kind of way of operating. So now trust becomes trust building is a skill, not a desire. Relationship is a skill. It's not a good thing to have if you can find it. You start moving all of the leadership conversations in the direction of observing what's missing to fulfill our commitments, and then organizing the conversations in order to produce what's missing. If we start addressing what's missing, then we're either going to have the future we're committed to, or we're going to have the correct feedback in order to work on what we need to work on to produce the future that we want. Or we quit BSing ourselves that we're committed to that and commit to something else, change the game.
And stop waiting around to see what the future holds when it's not a future we're moving into, but actually something we're creating based on the actions that we take.
Exactly. And I mean, I think that the biggest threat to success in a real-time world is people being spectators. Living like spectators in a society, commenting on everything without any action. Point of view doesn't change anything.
Absolutely. Makes sense. Jim, this has been so interesting. If people want to get the book or learn more about the work you're doing, where's the best place for them to go?
Well, Amazon.com has it. It's Living in a Real-Time World, 6 capabilities for preparing us for an unimaginable future. And also I have a website at realtimeworld.com. There's a hyphen between real and time.
Okay.
Real-time-world.com. And there's some other links and so forth there. But you can get it in Kindle or print. And it's also available in Kindle in Spanish. And in the next couple of weeks or months, we hope to finalize the Spanish print edition as well.
Great. So Living in a Real-Time World, we'll put links to all of those things in the show notes. Jim, thank you again for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate you taking the time to share. I'm grateful that I got an introduction to you from Dr. Gay Hendricks, who's been on the podcast in the past. And I hope you have a great golf game with him later.
Well, thank you very much, Andy, and thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right, take care.